You're listening to Civic from the San Francisco Public Press. Next week, thousands of people from around the world will be meeting in the UK to try to chart a path forward through the climate crisis. Among them will be local organizers from the Bay Area, advancing indigenous sovereignty in this space.
A lot of drastic changes are happening, and so it's definitely hit our front yards and our backyards and the very water we drink. So having a presence is really important.
This person in the administration that works on climate was just like, thank you so much, because it's actually cities and states that have had to hold down the climate work over the last years under the Trump administration. We had to continue moving forward because the federal government was obviously not going to be a leader.
I'm Laura Wennis, and this is Civic.
More severe storms and droughts, rising sea levels, warming temperatures, shrinking snow cover and ice sheets. It's already happening.
We are set to achieve 3 degrees of global warming. We need to reverse course and do it soon.
It might at times have seemed that the threat of the global climate crisis has receded, but it hasn't.
We will take concrete steps to harness climate innovative ideas.
It is not just the right thing to do, it's the economically smart thing to do.
Colombia is committed to reduce by 51% the CO2 emissions by 2030.
The climate crisis is wrecking lives and livelihoods and disproportionately affecting the poor and the most vulnerable in society.
The future I'd like to see is a future where everybody works together.
You speak up for what's right.
Action has to be taken now.
It is possible for everyone to make a difference.
What message do you hope that this will send?
That we are watching people, that we are not going to let them get away with more talking and not doing anything, pretending that the situation is under control.
Youth voices are among the loudest calling for action on climate change. But as you can hear, world leaders and others are also saying we have to do something. Right now, climate advocates are preparing to head to the 26th annual Conference of the Parties. You might hear these conferences referred to as COPs, and this one in particular as COP26. It's the UN Climate Change Conference, and it begins October 31st in Glasgow. The urgency around this isn't new. After all, this is the 26th conference. The Paris Climate Agreement, that legally binding international treaty on climate change, was adopted by 196 parties at COP21 in 2015. Here's a flashback to 2015 before that conference, when a then 15-year-old indigenous climate activist and, at the time, youth director of an organization called Earth Guardians addressed the United Nations General Assembly on climate change.
Kualitlanesi, buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. My name is Shutes Katonatiu. I'm very, very honored to be here today. We are approaching 21 years of United Nations climate talks, and in the last 20 years of negotiations, almost no agreements have been made on a bonding climate recovery plan. Our window of opportunity to take action is shrinking as the problem exponentially increases. We need you to take action at COP21 before it's too late. Because as I said, what's at stake right now is the future of your children, my children, our grandchildren. When we look into our eyes, we see the next generation, and we see that that is the planet that we are leaving to them. We look at the world, and we see the planet that we will leave to our generation. So don't be afraid to dream big.
At these conferences, delegates talk about their nation's emissions and what they're pledging to do in order to reduce them. Thousands of people are on their way this year, and among them are 2 locals.
Hi, my name is Kailea Frederick. I use she, her pronouns. I'm Tahltan, Casca, and a Black American. And I'm one of the climate justice organizers with Indian Collective and also a climate commissioner with the Petaluma Climate Action Commission.
My name is Sai. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the creative resistance coordinator for Indian Action and the Indian Collective. I'm also sit on the board with IP3, the Indigenous Peoples Powers Project.
The Indian Collective is an Indigenous-led and staffed organization dedicated to building Indigenous power. I wanted to play you this brief clip from a video that the collective put together, which describes a dream for climate justice. And if the narrator sounds familiar, that's because it's Kailea, who you just heard from.
Climate, an English word meaning region, part of the earth, or slope of the earth, has come to be our way of thinking about the future. Climate asks us how we want to weather the future. justice, from Latin, meaning righteousness, equity, upright, just, is a question, a spiritual imperative to find alignment between action and grounded connection. It begs, we reckon, with the centuries of inequity within ourselves, so we may move with integrity and our dignity fully intact. In this moment, we must dream the indigenous dream. And so we dream climate justice.
Both Kailea and Sai are based here in the Bay Area, and they'll be heading to Glasgow for this conference. I wanted to hear whether and how the decisions, activism, and policies on climate change that they're involved with here are connected with this global conference.
I mean, the shortest answer is yes. There's definitely overlap. The UN climate change conferences, the COPs, the 26th COP that our delegation from NDN Collective is currently heading to, these are some of the largest global conferences that take place. And so I said short answer, yes, in terms to what you initially were asking me, Laura, on, what it is that I work on locally, with the Petaluma Climate Action Commission, which is a policy advisory committee to the City Council of Petaluma, and then also my work at NDN Collective. And, NDN Collective, we are an Indigenous led and staffed organization. Our mission statement is to build power throughout Indigenous communities. And our climate justice campaign focuses on building power throughout Indigenous communities, but looking at the impacts of climate change, climate and environmental injustice, and also just transition frameworks. And so because the COPs are some of these, the largest conferences that take place in terms of convening governing bodies and also thousands of people that come to participate and advocate and rally as part of civil society, there are just so many different, I would say, issues that are brought forward. And so regarding our work at NDN Collective, we are going this year, because we're an Indigenous organization, our focal point at COP is going to be on the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and making sure that we're continuing to advocate for Indigenous peoples' sovereignty and looking at strengthening frameworks and upholding frameworks like UNDRIP and FPIC, which really are, FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. These are frameworks that are about Indigenous peoples being able to say ultimately yes or no what happens on their land.
Real quick, UNDRIP stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. FPIC, as Kailea said, is free, prior, informed consent, and it's one of the rights recognized in that declaration.
So yes, regarding my work with the climate justice campaign, a ton of overlap in terms of why it is that we show up at these spaces. Otherwise, we wouldn't be showing up. And in terms of some of our current fights that we're part of. And then with the local work, there is also, of course, overlap. There are all sorts of local government bodies that also show up to these spaces to exchange information. I believe they also there's a caucus that is just dedicated to local governance bodies. And I will not be participating in that caucus, but just to say that, it's just such a huge convening. So there is a lot of overlap.
I've been in communities going all the way back to where I'm originally from, Northern Arizona on the Dene Nation, where we've run into an ongoing problem around resource extraction and also water issues on our lands, living on a water table, pristine water that extracting companies are polluting or abusing or using in other forms of profit instead of giving it to the people. And it should be the very right that everyone has access to living, you would think, in this country. But the issues around that and the injustice around that are decisions that are made at these kind of conferences. And so rather than having people making decisions for you, you would think that's not the case, but that is. And it's usually in the favor of profit and money and more profit. So communities such as the community I come from and communities here, like in the Bay Area, live under the effects of those decisions that are being made. And so I think there should be a large presence for the people that are from the community that you're making decisions in. In more recent years, I think it's kind of ridiculous to hear that there's a fire season, but it's a real thing in California. And so other parts of the world are having that similar issue, a similar change in their surroundings and their environment, forcing some people to move because of health reasons. And a lot of drastic changes are happening. And so it's definitely hit our front yards and our backyards and the very water we drink. So having a presence is really important.
Something I didn't know beforehand is, how do organizations ensure that they have that presence? How does someone end up going to this global conference?
At the COP spaces, there's what is called an inside and an outside zone. The inside zone, you actually need accreditation, and it's within that space that you get what is called a badge. And it's within that space that the actual negotiating parties, those different governmental officials that are coming together, and then many other, all of the different caucuses and the different individuals like myself that are participating in some of those spaces, very closely following the negotiations and then advocating for real specific things, language and other types of text to be brought in. So that's the inside space. And in order to get in there, your organization needs accreditation and you have to apply for that. And then it's like you're able to get a badge. And there's some requirements around being able to be an organization that can apply as well. And then for those that want to just show up, as a part of this like broader civil society, there's the outside zone. And so the first year that I went to COP21 in Paris, I showed up with no accreditation. I was a part of Native youth delegation from the island of Maui, where I grew up. And it's as simple as deciding you want to take part in this big global convening and showing up, just, getting a plane ticket, making sure you have your housing in place, and then being present. And like I said, there's truly thousands of people that show up for that outside support. And so our organization, our delegation, like many others, we actually really specifically work with an inside-outside strategy. And so this year, we actually only have 3 badges for myself, my director, Jade Begay, and our policy director, Licia Maddox. So we'll be in the inside zone, but we're bringing a delegation of around 9 people. And so we're going to be in this constant dialogue in terms of all of the different actions. There's a lot of like marches and rallies and presentations and exhibitions, all sorts of different events that are happening simultaneously all day long for the 2 weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks, depending on how long some people go. So we'll have people that are holding down all of these different outside convenings, and we'll be in conversation with them for those of us that are on the inside. So that's a little bit of a breakdown. There's like part of it that's like, if you want to show up as civil society, you're more than welcome to. And then there's another layer. If you're wanting to show up officially and be participating within the space, there's a full accreditation process that takes months out in order to be able to get inside.
Talking about the inside, outside, and the accreditation process makes me just wonder what you think of that accreditation process and how good Indigenous representation is among those who get that accreditation.
The accreditation process is challenging. And, even just to say, for instance, our delegation this year, your organization needs to have applied to receive accreditation the year before. And so we actually did not have it because our campaign is still very new. So we didn't even exist last year for that process. What we ended up doing, what a lot of organizations end up doing, is approaching different allies that, other orgs that they're aware of have potential extra badges and stating like our delegation is in need of a badge. And even in those moments, it's a conversation of equity, because oftentimes, these are white-led organizations. Maybe these are organizations that are like, they're a philanthropic organization and they have been given access because of all of the historical injustices. And so we approach them even from a place of, we're an Indigenous-led organization and delegation, and we don't have the badges to get access into these spaces. And yeah, as a part of being a good ally, we would really appreciate it if you could lend us some badges over. So that's actually how, for us this year, how we got in. But also just to say, the COP process has never been equitable for so many different reasons. If you're coming from a nation state that is, maybe you're a Pacific Island nation state and you're truly like, your island nation is sinking because of sea level rise and you have less resources, even just like how much resources you have to send like a large negotiating body on your behalf is going to be much lesser so in comparison to a country from the global north like the US, who has like in some cases infinite resources to send like mini delegates over, so that you literally have people in rooms all over the place simultaneously. And then also just wanting to state too, because of COVID this year, and this has been a big conversation around COP26 specifically, there's a list of countries that, you have to go through a whole additional quarantine process, which is your organization has to pay out of pocket for that housing for those extra days. I think it's maybe like something like 5 extra days ahead of time on top of the travel. Maybe you're even traveling from further away. And so all to say, the COP process is never equitable, and it is almost always certain that Indigenous peoples, we really have to be so strategic in terms of how it is that we're able to even be sending people forward. And so the responsibility is really big just in terms of having our representation there, because there are so many people who should be in that space, so many voices and perspectives that just don't get the opportunity or have the access point.
This conference is pretty similar to how things work around the world for the lack of resources. You have communities who have supposed self-governing and supposed sovereignty in nations like the US, who will refuse a project that's happening and coming through their community, through their town, through their water. And a simple no is not enough. But other states and other cities who practice that same governance can say no and will be granted and will negotiate and will find terms where they have a somewhat equal agreement on grounds that these projects will go forward, like whether a pipeline is coming through or whether a ski resort is being built or whether a dam should stay functioning. These are some of the things that are brought to community's attention, but it's not necessarily a conversation. Like the decisions are already made. And so it's really important for individuals, for tribes, for voting members to practice that, but also to see it through and have representation and be heard. And so I think that's what we're practicing here.
I wanted to know if the institutions and the powers that be are actually hearing and recognizing people in communities that are practicing representation in this way.
It's slowly, but we're getting there. People are getting educated. People are educating themselves. Like from a tribal level, I think people that are being elected and going into office now have been somewhat in cases where organizations or where people in general have been working with. And so there's some accountability there going into those positions. It's a long line of like work that has been slowly making some sort of progress, but still needs a lot of work. I mean, I guess not just people who are being elected, but people who are leaders in their community. And whether you're from a small community or whether you're a part of a larger coalition, like city, place, or different urban areas, there's a long-standing history of people trying to put their voice out there, whether it's through the legal channels or whether it's taking action upon themselves. I'm not saying either one is wrong or right or which one's effective or not effective, but I think it all needs to work together.
We're going to take a quick break and come back to this conversation with local Indigenous climate organizers Kailea Frederick and Cy Wagoner about the 26th Conference of the Parties Climate Summit in just a moment. If you're a sci-fi fan and also into science, I have a podcast for you. A science/science fiction show called Our Opinions Are Correct, hosted by 2 writers based here in the city. Charlie Jane Anders, the award-winning author of several science fiction novels, including the recently released Victories Greater Than Death, and Annalee Newitz, an award-winning science journalist who writes for the New York Times and The Atlantic. It comes out every other week, and they've talked about all kinds of things, from the death of the universe to writing fight scenes. Join them as they expand minds and befriend cosmic monsters by looking up Our Opinions Are Correct wherever you listen to podcasts. Let's hear more about what local Indigenous advocates will be bringing to a global climate conference next week. Cy had mentioned elected representatives, so I want to talk about elections, because they matter both at the global level — elected officials and world leaders, after all, will have a presence at this conference — and at the regional, state, municipal, and local levels. Kailea said it was actually at a previous conference that she reflected on how much local elections matter to local action, and then also saw firsthand the ripple effect of the U.S. presidential election.
My home community on the island of Maui, we had just finished putting forward a citizens' initiative on the ballot to place a moratorium on the company Monsanto from continuing to do pesticide experimentation on our lands. This pesticide experimentation was taking place in very close relationship to homes and schools, and there was children's hair that was being tested that was showing these different pesticides found in them. And then even just the runoff into our oceans, seeing sea turtles coming up with big tumors on them. And so we had wanted to put a moratorium on the testing so that we could hire our own scientists to actually look at, is this testing safe? because Monsanto was saying, we've already looked at it and it is safe. And just wanting to say this kind of testing was actually bringing different kinds of pesticides in combination together that had never been brought forward together. So all to say that I really do not think that it was safe. And exposure to toxic pesticides for children and also just soil exposure is a very big deal. We actually won on the ballot measure, but what we failed to do as a populace was elect in the city council that was going to protect this initiative. And it was right after this moment in time that I attended my first COP. And I really remember just ruminating on how critical it is to make sure that people understand the implications of local election processes on their actual day-to-day experience, their actual day-to-day lives. And then COP22 was a very big moment because I was accredited that year with an organization called Sustain Us, where I think at this point it's been over 20 years of accreditation in terms of this organization sending youth delegates. And we're kind of thought of as like the official US youth delegates, which was an interesting position to be holding as an indigenous person. And so it was during that year that, or actually while we were there on the ground, I want to say it was maybe our like second or third day that the US presidential elections took place and President Trump was actually voted into office. And it still sends shivers through my body just in terms of how much this moment of being at the United Nations, so in a global space, how much it impacted me to receive that news and to be in the position of a US youth delegate, and to have global outlets really wanting to just ask our opinion and our thought process on what this meant for us. But also just, I remember receiving those election results with our delegation in the early morning and having a moment to literally grieve what it meant for many, many things, but of course, like what it meant for us to be showing up, as negotiators in the climate space, and then showing up actually at the COP. And it almost felt like it brought the COP to a standstill. I just remember people walking around in shock and crying, and also other youth delegates from around the world coming up to us saying, "Can we hug you? We're so sorry." And also, like, we're sorry for how this impacts us as well. Because unfortunately, what the US does in these spaces has far rippling effects into people's lives all around the world. And I just remember youth that are there fighting climate injustice, environmental injustice because of US war games taking place on the outskirts of like their country's ocean. And knowing that like those war games are going to continue with an administration like the Trump administration. And then sending, our delegation being sent the next year, COP, I believe, took place in Poland that year. And there being, I think, like actual pieces of coal-shaped and blackened, I think it was like pieces of soap that they actually had in the COP space for people to take away. Like the Trump administration, aside from just like pulling out of the Paris Agreement, sent out a message globally to these different countries that are like large emitters that it's okay to continue in the route and in the direction that we're going, which is large scale.
God.
Yeah, large scale emissions. So I just remember thinking, wow, especially as people who have access to voting in US elections, all the way from local to state to national, it's so absolutely critical. And then as a last point, to end on this question, Laura, I'm thinking back to a meeting I was in the spring with someone from the current Biden administration that works on climate. And, it was during the transition moment still, the administration was like still gathering their feet. But I just, in that meeting, I showed up speaking to participating in local climate work on a city level. And this person in the administration that works on climate was just like, thank you so much, because it's actually cities and states that have had to hold down the climate work over the last years under the Trump administration. We had to continue moving forward because the federal government was obviously not going to be a leader. We were, fighting rollbacks within the EPA. And so we as cities and states had to be the ones to come together and say, how is it that we're going to continue to advance our goals despite what the federal government is doing. And so she really was like in gratitude, just like you all held it down for us over the last years. And thank goodness. And that was such an important message, and something I really do want listeners to understand is that what is being done on the local level really matters. And I even see the federal government looking to us in terms of understanding what is working and what has not worked. So all to say, for anyone that is like in question around voting or in question around showing up to your city council meetings, like know that it matters. It's important.
For someone who's just starting out, though, or trying to figure out how to engage with this massive global issue from their vantage point on the ground, it can be hard to know where to start or what really will make a difference. So I asked Kailea and Sai what they say to people who are going through that, trying to look for ways to plug in.
I think just having a presence and being out there are people who are doing similar things and getting connected and knowing who's in your area. You don't really need to go to like a major city to be involved. Chances are like you're more effective in the place that you're at and organizing with those around you. So COP is happening, but there's also a lot of people organizing here in the US, here in the Bay Area. Right now, there's also a coalition of youth that have gone together, and there's a global day of action on the 29th of October. And so the understanding of that COP is happening and that we want to put it on people's radars, like listeners and public folks. There's a march happening in San Francisco. There's a circulating Facebook event out there, and there's some groups that are getting together. There's some people that are going to attend COP that are going to be there, but it's a large opportunity for people to meet each other. This is organized from a youth perspective. They feel like this is important and this needs to happen. And so they're siding with other organizations in the Bay Area and bringing presence to this in San Francisco. I think San Francisco is going to be one of 75 so far that are happening around the world.
And you can read more about that action, by the way, at fossilfreefuture.earth.
One of the main themes of COP this year is finance and looking at climate finance. And so this is very much tied to big things that are going to be discussed and looked at during the COP. And what these Fossil Free Future, what this broader coalition of youth is trying to draw attention to are the big companies that continue to fund all sorts of different things like extraction and deforestation. So real specifically, they're going after Chase Bank, Liberty Mutual Insurance, Citibank, and BlackRock Insurance. And then also because we're in the Bay Area, one thing I wanted to plug just in terms of getting people involved, there's this incredible program. They're based out of Oakland. They're called the Boards, Commissions, and Leadership Institute. It's a fellowship program that I participated in 2020, so last year. And this is just an incredible learning opportunity for anyone that's curious about getting involved in local governance. They really specifically train grassroots with an emphasis on Black, Indigenous, people of color, individuals to step into governmental committees and commissions and also boards. And so this is like I would say just like a phenomenal training program that is Bay Area wide, but based out of Oakland. Urban Habitat is the name of the organization that umbrellas them. And then I would also say just starting to show up at city council meetings, starting to show up at your local commission and committee meetings is another great way. A lot of these entities, they need public participation in order to be successful. So they need people to actually show up and advocate and state their needs and demands so that they can continue to be directed. Because ultimately, as a commissioner, I work for the community. It's not the other way around. And that's the case for every person who works in some type of like public servant role. We're beholden to what our broader community wants and what their needs are. So we actually need people to show up and tell us what they want to see happen. I think people oftentimes are asking, what is it that needs to happen? And I think it's actually pretty simple. It really comes down to decarbonization. Like we need mass decarbonization. And a really big part of this is keeping fossil fuels in the ground. We cannot get around that. I want to also just introduce to listeners, you should start thinking about what a post-oil future looks like for you, because that's something I certainly am thinking about with my family and is a reality that we need to start becoming a lot more comfortable with. And then as just a last thought that's tied to what I was just sharing, one of the things that we show up for as Indigenous people is consistently advocating against false solutions like carbon trading and things that continue to allow these big polluters and these extractive industries to continue operating as business as usual, with the idea that there's going to be some way that they can trade out their different carbon emissions, or that there's some type of quick, in the future technological fix. And the reality is that there isn't. And our only option at this moment in time is to really bring emissions down and to start thinking a lot more about, one, holding companies and governments truly accountable to the path that they set us all on, and two, starting to think about how we can all be consuming a little bit less. But it has to start with companies and governments, because even if as individuals we were to all stop consuming and we allowed companies and governments to continue operating in the way they were, we would still be moving forward on a fast track towards a rapidly heating world in a way that is almost unfathomable, I think, in terms of considering what awaits us. So they must be held accountable first and foremost in terms of stopping business as usual.
Kailea and Sai, thank you so much for making the time to talk with me.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Laura.
I'm Laura Wennis, and you've been listening to Civic. Civic comes to you from KSFP LP at 102.5 FM in San Francisco. Our theme music is by John Dillon. Our team includes producer and contributor Mel Baker and assistant producer Liana Wilcox. KSFP is a project of the San Francisco Public Press, a nonprofit investigative newsroom. Find our reporting at sfpublicpress.org. Civic airs Tuesdays and Thursdays at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. on KSFP. New episodes every Thursday. Thanks for listening.